Well, good morning, family at the Church at Spruce Creek. It's another Friday, and I would like to share with you a short devotional of something I've been meditating on as we prepare for Sunday. Of course, you know that Sunday is coming up, and the passage for this Sunday is going to be the last few verses of Hebrews chapter 6, where God compares the covenant he makes with us with the covenant he made with Abraham back in the day. And the specific passage that is the background of our text that we're going to be studying on Sunday is Genesis chapter 22, which is, of course, as you remember, the story where God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son. That his faith was, according to the text, tested by God with a command that makes no sense. God asked him to do something that was beyond anything that we could think would be reasonable or rational. So in the story it says, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. So the command comes to him from God to say, not only murder your son, kill your son, but nullify the promise of God, because what Isaac represents, he is the very embodiment of the promise. God said, in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. I will multiply your seeds, and they will become as many as the stars. And that promise reaches its first initial fulfillment with the birth of Isaac that Abraham had waited for 25 years. And so now God tells him to kill the child. I mean, how can God command us to do something that would nullify his promise, or do something that not only is it seemingly an inversion of a father's love for his children, but it would seemingly be a contradiction of God's own promises in his word. So how does Abraham respond? Well, verse 3 says, he rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, took two young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood, and he rose and went to the place of which God had told him. So Abraham astonishingly doesn't even hesitate. The very next morning, he's up as early as he can get up and get started for the day. As soon as it's becoming light, he's up splitting wood and packing his donkey and off on the road with his son. And as he's going, Abraham's faith in this continued promise of God is expressed in a couple of different ways. Now, there's this conversation that Isaac and Abraham have together. He says, Isaac says to him, we've got the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. And the two of them went together. And just before that, in the story, when he was leaving his hired men behind, he said, you guys stay here and we'll go worship. And what he says is in verse 5, you stay here with the donkey, the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. He says we will come back, even though he knows that he's fully intending to sacrifice his own son. So there's two indications of how Abraham is thinking when he's tested. He knows that Isaac embodies the promise, and he knows that promise is certain. So that means God has some other plan in mind. He's either going to provide an alternative, a substitute for Isaac, or perhaps, if need be, he'll resurrect Isaac. And that's why he says, we will come back to you. How can he say, we will come back to you, when he fully intends to sacrifice his own son? Well, only if he believes in the resurrection. And how does Abraham know that? Because he trusts in the power of God. He knows who God is, and he knows that there's nothing too hard for God. So Abraham, he is acting in instant obedience that is grounded in his knowledge of God's person and character. He knows this promise is true. He knows that God can do anything. And so he's willing to obey even a seemingly nonsensical command just because God tells him to. And so they go to the mountain, and they finally get there. And you remember the story, how dramatic it is that Abraham binds his son, puts him on the altar, and is raising the knife to plunge it in and to complete the sacrifice. And it's at that moment that the angel calls to him from heaven and says, do not lay a hand on your son or do anything to him, verse 12 says, "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And it's at that moment that Abraham looks up and he sees that there's a ram caught in the thicket, and he goes and catches that ram, and that ram takes the place of Isaac, dying in the place of Isaac as a burnt offering. And what I find striking about this story is the manner in which God tests our faith. At the end there, he says, God says to him, "I know that you fear God." And of course, the word "know" in Hebrew doesn't mean he gained knowledge he didn't have before. It means now he knows by experience. It's an experiential, relational type knowledge that's being described there. Is that now, having put you to the test, I have now proven what's in your heart, that you truly fear God. And now that there's a now deeper relationship that God has with Abraham and that Abraham has with God. Because God now has this experience in their relationship where Abraham has proven that he will obey anything. He will do whatever God says. And Abraham, in his turn, he now knows by his experience that God will always provide. That if he trusts his life to God and he does whatever God says, that God will work it out and God will provide for him. And so that's the result of that test. But what I've been reflecting on as I was reading this in preparation for Sunday is the manner in which God tests our faith. He's asking Abraham to give up that which he cherishes most in his life. What would Abraham cherish of all the gifts that God has given him in this life? His wealth, his wife, his child, his all the animals that he has, all of the things that he has. The thing that he cherishes most is Isaac, because Isaac represents that promise that he was given. And the text even points that out when God says to him, "Take now your son, your only son, whom you love." Oftentimes the way God tests our faith is he brings us to a crisis where we have to choose between doing what God says to do and keeping what we cherish most. And that's different for every one of us. Some people cherish most their health. Some people cherish most their money. Some people cherish most their spouse. Some people cherish most their children, their career. There's all kinds of things or their independence. There are all kinds of things that people love in this life more than anything else. And what it means to be a disciple is one of the ways God disciples us and proves our faith over time is he brings us to a point where we have to choose, and we have to ask ourselves, do I love this gift that God has given me more than God himself? And the, the way that choice is made is when holding on to this thing that God has given me comes in conflict with one of his commands. We have a command from God that says do this, but if I do that, that means I have to potentially give up this thing that I love the most. I have to maybe potentially sacrifice my money for it, or I maybe have to potentially sacrifice my health for it. I maybe have to potentially sacrifice my life for it, or I put my family at risk to do what God says. And God intentionally, just as he intentionally brought Abraham to that kind of a crisis, God sometimes intentionally brings us to that same kind of a crisis point where we have to make that choice. And as we choose to love God more than all of the good things that he has given to us, what we find is, just like Abraham, God provides. He can work out the results, and he can make it, even if we do lose that thing, he's able to give us something better in exchange. Even if we do have to give up something, even our lives, God is able to give that back to us, and more besides. Think also of the story of Job, how he lost everything, but as he was obedient to God and he turned back to God at the end, God, it says at the last chapter in Job that God gave him back that and more. He restored his fortunes in that sense, and that doesn't mean that restoration comes in this life. It may wait till the next, but God is generous to those who sacrifice for him, and he always provides. As it is said, the Lord will provide. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So I was just meditating on that a little bit, and I wanted to challenge you and encourage you with those words that maybe being a disciple means loving God more than anything in this world. And there will come a time in your life where you have to make that choice, because God loves you too much to let you make an idol out of the things he gives you. But take heart. Once you do make that choice and you are willing to give that up, he will make it right. You can trust the results to him, that whatever you give up for the sake of Christ, God takes that and he rewards you for it in due time, in this life or in the next, one or the other. So anyway, that will help us prepare our hearts, I think, for Sunday as we reflect on the kind of faith that Abraham had, that he was able to pass the test, and he was able to endure the trial, even the trial that God set on him, and in that way confirmed that that's the kind of faith that God is looking for in our lives. He wants us to fear him to that same degree. And as we live this Christian life, at some point we'll cross that stream, that bridge that Abraham had to cross. So as we're thinking about those things and thinking about the kind of faith that pleases God, the kind of faith that he regards as worthy of reward, think of Abraham, and as we meditate on that will help prepare our hearts for what God is going to say through Hebrews chapter 6 on Sunday. So look forward to seeing you there, either in person or online or wherever we are, and we'll worship God this weekend as well as we read in Hebrews 6. So have a good weekend, and we'll see you then.